The ballroom shimmered like a carefully rehearsed illusion, all crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed mirrors reflecting wealth back onto itself, as if money needed constant reassurance of its own existence. Silk gowns whispered across the marble floor, and laughter floated easily, polished and practiced, never lingering too long on anything real. Waiters moved like shadows between clusters of powerful guests, invisible unless a glass ran empty. Among them was Sofia Alvarez, carrying a silver tray that felt heavier with every step, not because of the weight of the champagne flutes, but because of the eyes that slid past her as though she were part of the decor. She had learned this kind of invisibility young, learned how to stand straight without demanding space, how to exist quietly without shrinking. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her black dress plain and borrowed, a stark contrast to the glittering excess around her. At the center of the room stood Elias Moreau, the man everyone had come to see whether they admitted it or not. He wore confidence like a second skin, tailored as precisely as his suit, his presence bending conversations toward him the way gravity bends light. He smiled and people leaned closer. He laughed and others followed, relieved to be included. His fortune had been built on sharp instincts and sharper edges, and tonight he was in his element, playing the gracious benefactor at a charity gala he'd funded with a fraction of what he earned in a single hour. An orchestra waited along the far wall, instruments gleaming, fingers poised, filling the room with soft background music meant to decorate conversations rather than interrupt them. As Sofia passed near a group gathered around Elias, a careless elbow knocked her tray, and she caught it just in time, steady hands preventing disaster. A ripple of amused murmurs followed, someone chuckling about the help, and heat rose to her cheeks, though her expression remained calm. Elias noticed her then, not because of the near mishap, but because she didn't apologize profusely or scurry away. She met his gaze for a brief second, eyes dark and steady, then moved on. Something about that look pricked his ego, a quiet refusal to be impressed. As the orchestra shifted into a tango, the music grew bolder, more insistent, its rhythm slicing through the chatter. Someone nearby joked loudly about passion and drama, about how tango was a dance of seduction, and laughter followed. Elias, fueled by the easy cruelty that often passed for wit in rooms like this, felt an impulse rise, sharp and performative. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "You know," he said, gesturing casually toward Sofia's retreating figure, "if she dances the tango, I'll marry her." The words landed like a spark in dry grass. Laughter exploded, glasses clinked. A few guests gasped theatrically, delighted by the audacity of it all. It was a joke, obviously, a harmless display of power wrapped in charm. Sofia stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around. The room seemed to tilt, attention snapping toward her as if surprised she'd heard it all. She didn't rush, didn't fluster. She walked back toward the center, each step measured, her tray still perfectly balanced. When she reached Elias, she set it down gently on a nearby table. The orchestra faltered, uncertain. "Did you say something?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the fading laughter. Elias smiled, indulgent, sensing an opportunity to double down. "Only that if you dance," he repeated smoothly. "I'll marry you." More laughter, though thinner now, edged with discomfort. Sofia studied him for a heartbeat that felt longer than it was, then nodded once. "Then play," she said, turning slightly toward the musicians. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the orchestra hesitated, then resumed, the tango surging back to life, richer and more commanding than before. Sofia stepped onto the open floor. At first, her movements were restrained, almost cautious, as if she were listening for permission from the music itself. Then something shifted. Her shoulders relaxed, her spine lengthened, and the dance claimed her fully. Each step was precise, grounded, her feet tracing patterns that spoke of long nights and older memories. This was not a performance crafted for approval. It was an expression carved from lived experience. Her arms cut through the air with intention, her turns sharp and fearless, her pauses heavy with meaning. The chatter died completely. Guests leaned forward unconsciously, breaths held, champagne forgotten. Elias felt his smile falter. This was no longer entertaining. It was unsettling. There was a story unfolding in her movements. Loss and resilience, pride and defiance. Things he had spent a lifetime insulating himself against. The music swelled, and Sophia answered it. Every step a declaration. Every glance outward daring the room to look away. When the final note struck, she stopped, chest rising and falling, the echo of the dance hanging thick in the air. Silence crashed down, absolute and undeniable. No applause came at first, no laughter, no clever remarks. Just quiet. Sophia looked at Elias once more, not expectant, not triumphant, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was. Then she turned, retrieved her tray, and walked back into the sea of glittering guests, leaving behind a millionaire who stood frozen, surrounded by a silence he had never bought and could not escape. The silence she left behind followed Elias long after the gala ended, clinging to him like a question he couldn't dismiss. In the days that followed, the city returned to its usual rhythm. Traffic, meetings, numbers stacking neatly into profits. But something in him had shifted, a small fracture in the armor he'd worn his entire life. He replayed the moment again and again, not the laughter or his own careless words, but the way the room had obeyed her without being asked, the way music had bent itself around her will. It irritated him at first, this inability to forget a waitress whose name he didn't even know. He was used to women trying to be seen, to be chosen. Sophia had done neither, and that absence gnawed at him. During board meetings, his mind drifted, spreadsheets blurring as he imagined the echo of her steps on marble. His assistant noticed the distraction, hesitated before mentioning that he'd requested information from the catering company more than once. When the file finally landed on his desk, thin and unimpressive, it annoyed him further. No social media worth noting, no wealthy connections, no scandal. Just a name, an address, and a note that she worked multiple jobs. On impulse, he told himself was curiosity. Elias drove across the city to a neighborhood he rarely entered, where buildings leaned close together and the air smelled of bread and exhaust. Sophia's apartment sat above a small bakery, its windows fogged with warmth. When she opened the door, surprise flickered briefly across her face before settling into guarded calm. "You're far from your world," she said, not unkindly. He nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place his expensive coat looked against the chipped paint of the hallway. "I came to apologize," he said, the words feeling strange and used. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. The apartment was modest but alive. Sunlight spilling across wooden floors, music sheets scattered on a table, a pair of worn dance shoes resting near the wall like old friends. He took it all in, realizing how little he knew about spaces that didn't announce their worth. Over tea, she listened as he spoke, really spoke, for perhaps the first time without an agenda. He admitted the joke had been thoughtless, that he hadn't expected her to answer it with such quiet power. Sophia didn't interrupt. When he finished, she simply said, "You didn't embarrass me. You showed everyone who you were." The honesty stung, but it also felt clean. She told him pieces of her story, not as a plea but as context. Her mother had danced tango in small halls, in kitchens, wherever there was room to move. When money was scarce, music filled the gaps. Tango wasn't performance for Sophia. It was language, memory, survival. Elias listened, uncomfortable in his own stillness. He found himself returning over the next weeks, at first with awkward excuses, then with none at all. He watched her teach dance classes to children in a community center, saw how she corrected them with patience, how their faces lit up when they finally caught the rhythm. No cameras followed him there. No one cared who he was. Strangely, he found relief in that. He began funding the center quietly, insisting his name be kept off the wall. He learned to sit and observe instead of command. One evening, as they locked up the studio, he confessed, "When I said I'd marry you if you danced, I thought I was untouchable." Sophia smiled, not cruelly but knowingly. "Power feels lighter when you don't use it to crush," she said. The words stayed with him, He noticed changes in himself, listening more, speaking less, questioning motives he'd never examined. What began as fascination softened into respect, then deepened into something that unsettled him far more than her dance ever had. Love crept in quietly, without spectacle, built from shared silences, from laughter over burnt coffee, from evenings where music played low and they talked about nothing and everything. Elias realized, with a mix of awe and fear, that he was no longer the one setting the terms. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to. The final gala returned them to the same world where everything had begun, but nothing felt the same now, not to Elias and not to the people who sensed, without understanding, that something significant hovered in the air. The ballroom glittered again beneath crystal chandeliers, yet the light seemed softer, less blinding, as though even wealth had learned to stand back and watch. Guests arrived in waves of silk and confidence, but their conversations kept drifting toward the stage where the orchestra tuned their instruments, whispering about a surprise Elias Moreau had planned. He stood backstage, fingers adjusting his cufflinks not out of habit this time, but to steady a pulse that refused to slow. Business negotiations had never done this to him. Hostile takeovers hadn't either. Tonight felt different because the outcome wasn't something he could control with money or precision. Across the room, Sophia stood among the guests, not hidden at the edges, not elevated as a spectacle, simply present, her posture relaxed, her eyes calm. She wore a deep red dress that echoed the tango's fire without screaming for attention, and when she caught Elias's gaze, she offered a small, grounding smile. The host announced him, and applause rose automatically, but Elias lifted a hand, gently asking for quiet. The room obeyed, curiosity replacing habit. He stepped forward, microphone in hand, the polished floor reflecting his image back at him, a reminder of who he had been and who he was trying to become. He spoke slowly, letting each word find its place instead of rushing to impress. He told them about the first gala, about the joke that had earned laughter and then silence, about how he'd believed power meant standing above others, untouchable and unquestioned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned. He gestured toward the orchestra. "There is someone here who taught me that true strength isn't loud," he said, his voice steady. "And that grace doesn't ask permission." The musicians began to play, the opening notes of a tango unfurling like a held breath finally released. Elias stepped down from the stage, ignoring the flash of cameras, and crossed the floor toward Sophia. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Sophia looked at his hand, then at his face, searching not for promises, but for truth. Finding it, she placed her hand in his, and together they stepped onto the floor. They did not dance to impress. Their movements were imperfect, human, shaped by trust rather than rehearsal. Elias followed her lead more than once, learning in motion what he had struggled to learn in life, and Sophia matched his steps with patience, guiding without diminishing. The tango wrapped around them, fierce and intimate, telling a story of meeting in the middle rather than conquering. When the final note faded, the silence returned, but this time it was warm, reverent, filled with understanding instead of shock. Elias turned to Sophia, his eyes bright, his voice carrying without the microphone. He spoke of the promise he'd once mocked with arrogance, of how he'd thought marriage was a reward to be offered, not a commitment to be earned. He knelt, not dramatically, but deliberately, grounding himself on the polished floor. "I don't want you because you danced," he said quietly. "I want you because you taught me how to listen, how to change, how to love without conditions." He asked her to marry him, not as a challenge, not as a spectacle, but as a choice freely given. Sophia felt the room fade away, leaving only the man before her and the journey that had brought them here. She thought of her mother's music, of kitchens turned into dance floors, of dignity reclaimed step by step. She nodded, tears bright but steady, and said yes. Applause erupted then, loud and unrestrained, but it felt secondary, like an echo. The true ending had already landed, silencing everyone not with shock, but with truth, as two lives met in rhythm and chose, at last, to move forward together.